Yesterday, Newsfirst reported startling revelations made by the New York Times on China's direct involvement in funding Sri Lankan elections and its stranglehold on Sri Lanka. And in today's top story, we delve deeper into the details of the report, which highlight Sri Lanka's debt crisis, primarily because of the Hambantota port project. In its investigative report headlined "How China Got Sri Lanka to Cough Up a Port," the New York Times said Chinese officials and the China Harbour Company, which constructed the Hambantota port, went to great lengths to keep relations strong with President Mahinda Rajapaksa, to the point that large payments started to flow towards the president's circle as the presidential election drew closer. The New York Times reported at least $7.6 million was dispensed from China Harbour's account at Standard Chartered Bank to affiliates of Rajapaksa's campaign. The New York Times said similar reports emerged from countries like Bangladesh and the Philippines, adding that both the countries had banned China Harbour from future projects on accusations of bribing officials and other corruption practices. Quoting former Indian Foreign Secretary Shiva Shankar Menon, the New York Times said the government of President Mahinda Rajapaksa initially approached India for the port. But after its refusal, Rajapaksa later announced that China had agreed to get on board for the port. The first loan at $307 million had originally come at a variable rate that usually settled above 1 or 2%. For comparison, the New York Times says rates on similar Japanese loans for infrastructure projects run below 0.5%. The report in its investigation further reveals that in 2010, the president's 65th birthday was approaching, and to mark the occasion, he wanted a grand opening at the Hambantota port. Chinese laborers began working day and night to get the port ready, but when workers dredged the land and then flooded it to create the basin of the port, they had not taken into account a large boulder that partly blocked the entrance, preventing the entry of large ships. China Harbour blasted the boulder a year later at a cost of $40 million. Determined to keep expanding the port, President Mahinda Rajapaksa went back to the Chinese government in 2012, asking for $757 million. The Chinese agreed again, but this time the terms were much steeper. But to secure fresh funding, that initial loan was renegotiated to a much higher 6.3% fixed rate. Rajapaksa acquiesced. Under Rajapaksa, the country's debt had increased threefold to $44.8 billion when he left office. And for 2015 alone, a $4.68 billion payment was due at the year's end. The central bank estimated that Sri Lanka owed China about $3 billion last year. Economists estimated that debt owed to China could be as much as $5 billion and was growing every year. In May, Sri Lanka took a new $1 billion loan from China Development Bank to help its coming debt payment. While Sri Lanka had fallen into a deeper debt trap, the new government signed an agreement to lease the Hambantota port to China for a period of 99 years in December last year. According to the New York Times, China has helped finance at least 35 ports around the world in the past decade. 2 of these ports are in Sri Lanka. The New York Times reports that China had a stake in Sri Lanka's main port as well. China Harbour was building a new terminal there, known at the time as Colombo Port City. Along with that deal came roughly 50 acres of land solely held by the Chinese company that Sri Lanka had no sovereignty on. The New York Times said the handover of the Hambantota to the Chinese has kept alive concerns about possible military use, particularly as China has continued to militarize island holdings around the South China Sea, despite earlier pledges not to. The New York Times says Sri Lankan officials have been quick to point out that the agreement explicitly rules out China's military use of the site.
During the previous presidential campaign time, we saw that money has came in very big numbers to do the very aggressive election campaigning, and moreover, we saw after this regime change took place, we have to pay these amounts, this money back to the Chinese government, and we was not able to do it, and instead of paying it back, we have to hand it over the the Hambantota port for Chinese industries, which was not on the national interests of the Sri Lanka. But here, when the negotiation process took place on Hambantota and Colombo port city, the experts in Sri Lanka continuously argue that the favorations are given to the Chinese government instead of getting it back to the Sri Lankans. So we know that concretely with this comprehensive report that the previous government, previous regime benefited out of this for their election campaign. But here, in the other hand, we are now experiencing the same pattern of Chinese loans in a very high interest rates. We now very surely know with very comprehensive details the previous Mahinda Rajapaksa regime got the favorations. Is the present government also getting that sort of a favorations from the Chinese government?